The topic of this lecture is moral objectivism. With the failure of moral subjectivism and moral relativism, it seems like we might have to start coming to grips with the fact that morality is an objective issue after all, and not a subjective or relative one. However, the failure of subjectivism and the failure of relativism is not enough to establish objectivism. Right? So if one's opponents are bad, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're good. And so we need some more active defense of the moral objective view, and we get that from a couple of different sources, both from Schaefer-Landau in talking about defending objectivism for many arguments against it, as well as David Enoch's article, "Why I'm an Objectivist About Ethics and Why You Are Too." And so before we get going too far, I want to make a brief note on terminology using the term objectivism. I don't want it to get confused with something else. So the writer Ayn Rand, went by that pen name, had a view that she called objectivism and her followers called objectivism, but it's not exactly the same thing as what we mean by moral objectivism. Now, while she probably did in fact think that morality is objective, her view really is best described as ethical egoism, the specific view that she called objectivism. That view is in fact addressed by Schaefer-Landau in the Fundamentals of Ethics, Chapter 8. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested. But I just wanted to make sure that you're sort of confused as to what's going on. You might have seen this before. You might have seen Rand or heard of objectivism. It's not quite what we're after here. What we're after is a very broad, very general view about morality that we refer to as moral objectivism. This is how Schaefer-Landau puts it on page 323. He says, ethical objectivism is the view that there are some objective moral standards, that those standards apply to everyone, even if people don't believe that they do, and even if obeying them fails to satisfy a person's desires. Another way to put this is that there are moral facts, okay? When someone says that a thing is moral or immoral, their claim must either be true or false, right? And again, independently of what they think it is. Of course, if somebody makes a moral claim, they probably think that claim is true. That's not what makes it true. What makes it true is something else. There's going to be something objective that settles the factual status of moral claims. That's the central thesis of moral objectivism. And so David Enoch gives us this really wonderful article here, Why I Am an Objectivist About Ethics and Why You Are Too. And he starts off, he gives sort of three of these, three arguments is what he gives. And he starts off with what he calls the spinach test, right? And borrows this joke from the famous ethicist Christine Korsgaard. So he puts it this way. So here's the joke. Okay, he says the child says, "I'm glad I hate spinach," and some says, "Why?" And he says, "Well, because if I liked it, I'd eat it, and it's yucky." Okay, and that's kind of funny, right? I mean, not like the funniest joke in the world. Not like it's not quite as funny as my dog has no nose. Whoa, how does he smell? Awful, right? I mean, that's a much better joke. But yeah. So in any case, it's funny, and there's some interesting things about that. And as Enoch puts it, we're going to have to be obnoxious in a second and try and explain why it's funny, because that's usually the obnoxious thing to do, is try and explain why things are funny. But I just want to point out, this here is the spinach joke, okay? This thing here that we've listed. The spinach test is the modification of this example to see if it retains its humorous value, okay? And so don't mix up the spinach joke and the spinach test here. This is just the spinach joke, right? The test is what's to come once we start modifying it. And again, I want to make sure that you don't have the impression that these lectures replace the reading in any way. Of course, Enoch goes into much better and greater detail about so many of these things. I'm just sort of highlighting and pointing out some of the important stuff here. And so again, contrast a second way of putting the spinach joke, right? So say the child says, "I'm glad I wasn't born in the Middle Ages." And the adult says, "Why?" And the child says, "Because I would have believed that the sun revolved around the earth, as the people in the Middle Ages did. And that isn't true." I mean, that's kind of a cute thing for a kid to say, but it's not funny, right? It doesn't really work as a joke. It's just, it's like, oh, well, why, I'm sure glad of this. Why? Well, because if otherwise I would have believed something false. And I don't want to believe false things. It's like, oh, okay, well, that seems actually like a good reason not to want to be born in the Middle Ages, right? It just doesn't work as a joke the way that the spinach joke does. And so it isn't really funny, right? Again, we're going to have to be obnoxious, say, why isn't it funny? Okay, what do the funny versions of this have in common, and the unfunny versions also have in common with each other? And of course, then what is the difference between the two? So let's take a look at another couple of examples and hope to sort of build this idea of what the funny versions have in common with each other and what the unfunny versions have in common with each other, and what the difference between the two is. So let's give you another example here. Let's set it up this way. Some child says, I'm glad I don't like jazz. It's like someone tells, well, why not? Well, because if I did, I'd listen to it, and it's awful. Okay, right? Again, that's funny, right? It's funny just the same way that the spinach joke is funny, and it does work as a joke. Example number 4, we might say, a child says, well, I'm really glad I'm not schizophrenic. And someone might say, why? Well, because schizophrenics sometimes see or hear things that aren't really there. And that would be hard to deal with. Again, that'd be a very insightful thing for a kid to say. And if it's a very young kid, he might say it was funny in the sense of being sort of a peculiar thing for a child to say. But it's not funny. It doesn't work as a joke, right? And you don't want to laugh at. So you say, well, that actually sounds like a pretty good reason why you're glad you're not schizophrenic, right? So there we go. So again, we have 2 examples of each. So think for a second. Maybe even pause the video and think for a second. What is it that these things have in common? Right? What is it that the funny versions have in common with each other, that the unfunny versions have in common with each other? And then what's the difference between those 2 groups? And so it seems like when we really look at it, the commonality and the difference of each of these, it starts to look like whenever we're dealing with a matter of personal taste that is a subjective issue, the joke works. Okay, so like whether you like spinach or not, whether you like jazz or not, right? Those seem to be subjective issues. Those are at least issues that we're happy to treat as if they're subjective. And the joke works in those cases. It's funny, right? But then when we're dealing with just a matter of fact, like what people in the Middle Ages believed, or what a diagnosis of schizophrenia means or responds to, well, it just doesn't seem to work, right? It's not very funny. And so now we have the actual spinach test. Okay, let's test morality by throwing it into the format of the spinach joke. Okay? Let's format it with a moral issue and see what happens. So some child says, hey, I'm sure glad I wasn't born in 1840. And the adult says, why? Well, because I would have believed that slavery is okay, and it isn't. Well, is that funny? Doesn't strike me. It sounds a lot more like the one about the Earth being round, or about schizophrenics, and that's, it doesn't work as a joke. And so the argument seems to be something like this. Okay, that the first premise is that the spinach joke is funny for subjective issues and not funny for objective issues. That seems to be what we've learned from looking at the examples we've looked at. And a second premise might be that the spinach joke is not funny for moral issues, just as we put it in there. And so what would that mean? Well, it would mean that moral issues are objective issues. Okay, so if the joke it's funny for subjective ones, not funny for objective issues, and the spinach joke is not funny for moral issues, that must make moral issues objective. Okay, I mean, look, it's not the strongest possible argument in the world, but it is a valid argument. I don't know if we want to sort of make up our mind about the status of morality on the basis of this example, but it's a good hint, right? And I think it will get us started off looking in the right direction. He gives 2 more arguments, and again, I encourage you to really do the reading very carefully to see his actual reasoning here. But I can summarize those, right, and lay them out in formal terms. So we have what we could call the argument from the phenomenology of disagreement. Right? Phenomenology being what it feels like to have a certain experience. And so again, the first part of this argument says this. It says it feels different to disagree about matters of fact than it does about matters of taste. So if you imagine arguing with somebody over whether climate change is real, or arguing with somebody over which of 2 kinds of chocolate is better, one of those things just feels much different than the other, right? They feel like 2 fundamentally different kinds of disagreement. And so a premise 2 might say that moral disagreements, and this is one of those things where he just appeals, he just asks, he says, what does it feel like to you to disagree with somebody about a moral issue? Like, say, whether abortion is morally permissible or not. Does it feel more like disagreeing about facts, or does it feel more like disagreeing about chocolate? Okay, and this is one where he's like I can't tell you what you feel like, but in my case, it sure feels more like I'm arguing about facts here, and I think that I think most people would say that it feels more like arguing about something that like matters, that somebody might actually be right or wrong about. That's why we actually care about these kinds of disagreements as opposed to disagreements about chocolate. We don't really care about any of those. Like nobody bombed anybody over chocolate. Um, and so the conclusion seems to be, notice what's going on here. What Enoch is, remember the title of the piece, he says, why I'm an objectivist about ethics and why you are too, right? And so he's saying certainly in his own case, he thinks that morality feels more like a disagreement about real things than like about objective things than about subjective things. He says, but if you also feel like morality feels more like a disagreement about objective than subjective things, then you also think that morality is objective. And that's a very modest conclusion here, but that's all he's going for here. He also provides a third argument, we call it the counterfactual justification argument, and he puts it this way. He says he introduces this first premise that if our attitudes do not affect our reasons to do a thing, then that thing is an objective matter. And he gives us a nice contrast. So he gives a contrast between sort of wearing a top hat, right? He says, look, if right now he says top hats are not fashionable, right? And so if you want to feel really sort of different, then that's a good reason to wear a top hat. And if you really don't, that's a good reason not to wear one. But the question is, if everybody's attitudes about top hats were different, would we still be able to say that they were unfashionable? And it seems like we would not. If everybody's attitudes about top hats were that they were awesome and everyone should wear them, well, then they wouldn't be out of fashion. Okay, and so that's the idea. He's like, that's the counterfactual part of this. And so then the other thing is he talks the example he gives is of gender discrimination. Right? The idea is that if everybody thought that gender discrimination was okay, would that make it okay? Well, that's a much different kind of a question, at the very least, than the question about the fashionability of top hats. Fashionability seems like it's determined just by whatever people think. Okay, that's in some sense the very definition of fashion. But morality doesn't really seem that way. It seems like if everybody thought that gender discrimination was okay, and some certain people in different times and places have thought so, well, that means that they were mistaken. That means that they were wrong. They didn't know the truth there. That we think that gender discrimination is wrong, right? Always has been, even if people didn't think so at some particular time and place. And so that's our second premise then, that our attitudes do not affect our reasons for behaving morally. That is that things are moral or immoral because of how those things are, not about how we feel about them. That's not what determines the issue. And so his conclusion then is that morality is an objective matter. So these are at least some defenses of moral objectivity. More defenses of moral objectivity are given by Schaefer-Landau in the recommended reading, 11 Arguments Against Moral Objectivity. And again, Schaefer-Landau does a really excellent job of formally presenting the arguments, going through the way that they have to work one by one. And I'm just going to give you a couple as examples of the sorts of things they mean. Again, the reading is better than the lecture here. So he says that some argument, I'm going to give you some of these. So here's one. I believe it's the sixth one that he gives. The first premise is that if ethical objectivism is true, then all moral standards apply universally to everyone in every society. Right? Well, that seems to be at least part of what we gave as a definition earlier of ethical objectivism. And so a premise two might be that some moral standards do not apply universally, but only in certain cultural or social contexts. And it seems like we can come up with a number of good examples of things that are just sort of different artifacts of culture, right? That seem to apply in some places, but not so much others. And so if those things are both the case, then ethical objectivism would be false. Again, this is a valid argument. Its form is what we would call modus tollens. That is, we have an if A, then B, right? And then premise two says not B, and so the conclusion is not A, right? That's a standard valid argument form. And so if an argument is valid, but you think that the conclusion is false, there's only one possible way that the conclusion can in fact be false. One of the premises or more have to be false as well. Okay, that's the thing about a valid argument. Remember the definition of validity. A valid argument is one where if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be. And so if you're looking at a valid argument, and this is a valid argument, the only way to resist the conclusion is if at least one of the premises happens to be false. That's the only way you can get a false conclusion out of it. And so people who defend moral objectivism, like Schaefer-Landau, will deny premise one, right? And they will deny it with a counterexample. They will say, consider the general rule, be respectful. Okay? This could apply everyone, everywhere, okay, while still allowing for cultural variation in what counts as respectful. For example, in some cultures, eye contact is respectful, while in other cultures it is disrespectful. Okay, so again, we don't have to be quite so rigid in saying that there are some moral standards that apply universally. That doesn't necessarily mean that the exact same moral rule with all the exact same moral detail applies literally everywhere, or that there is no cultural variation among how certain moral principles are interpreted or applied. So there's some possibility. So another argument that he gives, I think this is number 11, I want to say maybe, that it's something like this one, right? Because we're talking about objective things, we're talking about facts, all that sort of stuff. That brings science up to most people. So the first premise of this argument is that if science cannot verify the existence of a thing, then the best evidence tells us that that thing does not exist. Okay? Premise two of this argument is that science cannot verify the existence of objective moral values, and so that the conclusion we can draw from these two things is that the best evidence tells us that objective moral values do not exist. Okay? Again, that's just modus ponens, right? If A then B, A therefore B. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. It's a valid argument. So again, if one wanted to disagree with the conclusion, one could only do so by denying at least one of the premises, right? Saying that there's some reason to believe they're false. Schaefer-Landau presents two different strategies that moral objectivists can use in response to this argument. The first of those accepts premise one, accepts that if science cannot verify the existence of a thing, then the best evidence tells us that thing does not exist. But they deny premise two. They believe that science can verify the existence of objective moral values. In fact, this view, the view that moral values are sort of, in some sense, scientifically intelligible, is a view called moral naturalism. It's the view that moral features are part of the natural world. So one crude way of putting this would be to say, look, what morality means, right? Morality is about what kinds of things cause people pleasures or pains or etc. And pleasures and pains are parts of the physical universe, right? They're things that the laws of nature can talk about with complete legitimacy. And so if you couch morality in terms of those kinds of things or other kinds of objective features of human well-being, then what you're doing is you're giving a kind of scientifically verifiable notion of morality, right? So that's one way you could go about this. The other strategy is to deny premise one, but accept premise two, right? To say that science, it's true, right, that science cannot verify the existence of objective moral values, but that it's just not true that, something that science can't verify can't exist or something like that. And so they, again, use a counterexample against premise one. They say, look, science can't verify the existence of art, but that doesn't mean there's no such thing as art, right? And that's well taken. There is no scientific definition of art, right? There's no gadget that's like an art detector or something. I mean, it's just not one of those things. I think that this second approach here is much more common. The idea is to say, well, look, science is well and good for what it does, but it's not everything. Not every part of human knowledge or things that are important to humans are scientifically intelligible. Science does science, and we have other things that do other things, and morality is a field unto itself. That's a very common response. I actually think that both of these approaches are correct. I actually think it's true that science can verify the existence of some objective moral values, and I think I also think that premise one is false. So, I think both of these approaches I think are correct-ish in some way, but it doesn't really matter what I think actually. So, so those are some of the arguments that Schaefer-Landau does give us. And so what are some of the implications of moral objectivism, of coming at morality in the sense that of this of coming at morality, accepting that there are the real facts of the matter here? Well, the first implication is that there are moral facts. Okay, that is, some real feature of the world is what makes something right or wrong. Now we'll see some candidates. You want to say, gosh, what could that possibly be? What feature of the world is it that makes things morally right or wrong? Well, I mentioned a couple of candidates a bit before. One candidate is something like pleasures and pains, right? That those sorts of things those are real features of the world, and they do seem to be morally relevant. I will say that the outcomes of rational procedures, okay, is another thing that we'll end up taking a look at. Facts about intent, right? Those are going to be some things that we're going to end up pointing to as candidates for real moral theories. But of course, we've got a little bit of work to do before we get that far. So one of the other implications, though, and I just want to make sure that this is absolutely clear, it depends on the person is never going to be the right answer in ethics. It's if you're tempted to start speaking that way, go back through the subjectivism and the relativism lectures, and until you're no longer tempted to do this, because it's never the right answer. And it's inevitable every semester, all the way to the end of the course. In the final paper, I have somebody, who's asked to evaluate two different ethical views and say, yeah, it just depends on the person. And I'll be like, gosh, no, it's never the right answer. So don't be tempted. And I want you to be aware not only of the implications of moral objectivism, but on what aren't actually implications of moral objectivism. Okay? So first off, saying that there are moral facts is not the same thing as saying that we know what they all are. Okay, that's one of those things that you have to keep a distinction between what's true and what's believed. All kinds of things are true that nobody happens to believe. All kinds of things are believed that don't happen to be true. Okay, beliefs and truth are just two different things. A belief is something that is in somebody's head, something somebody thinks. A truth is about the world. Okay, it's about the way the world is. If the way the world is a certain way and somebody says that, then it's so. If the cat is on the mat and somebody says the cat is on the mat, they've said something true. If they say the cat is on the mat and it isn't, they've said something false. That's really, whatever you think about the world is the way it is. Okay, so when your thoughts match up with the way the world is, your thoughts are true, and when they don't, they're false. Okay, so beliefs, truths are two different things. They stand or fall entirely separately. Okay, and so saying that there are moral facts is not the same thing as saying that we have beliefs about what all those moral facts are, that our beliefs are correct in any way, right? Yes, we have many beliefs about what the moral facts are, and one of the things that we'll be doing is we'll be starting to examine evidence, right? What actually counts as evidence that something is a moral fact or isn't. Okay, and that's going to be where we're going to use argument very carefully. We're going to be very precise with our language, and we're going to be very critical. That is, we're going to want to make sure that we're not making mistakes when we want to examine what sort of reasons we have for saying something is a moral fact or isn't. And it's going to be it's hard work, and but it's very interesting work, and it's very important work. And so one of the things that we have to come to grips with is that we don't, in fact, know what all of the moral facts are. Okay, we might not know for sure what any of them are, but notice that's not a problem for ethics. That's a problem that everybody has, right? Physicists don't know that everything that they think is correct. They're more confident in some things than others, but of course, nobody ultimately knows. Historians don't know exactly what happened in a particular case. Again, they're more confident about some things than others, but they don't know. Look, this is a problem in all areas of human knowledge, so don't think it's a big problem just for ethics. It is what it is. Okay, so even though we're not going to be completely sure, right? There's not some great book of all truth to look our answers up in once we're done here. If there were, we wouldn't bother with the class. We'd just hand you the great book of all truth and say, okay, have fun, everybody, right? Education would be a lot cheaper in that case. But we don't have that. So not in ethics, not anywhere. And so what we have to do is the next best thing. We have to take the evidence we do have and be really careful with it and think about it. Okay, we have to use our brains on this one. And so the fact that we don't know for sure any of the moral facts, it sort of tempts people to think a few things about the humanities in general, but ethics in particular. They tend to think that they want to say, well, there's no right answer. Okay. Well, that's not entirely true. Okay. There is a right answer, even if we don't precisely know what it is. But one thing we definitely know, there are definitely wrong answers. There are things that we can be pretty confident are just not relevant or not true. Like I said, if you go back and look at the kinds of arguments we have against views like moral subjectivism and cultural relativism, you'll see that we can be pretty sure that these aren't it, right? They're very bad candidates. They have very, very, very serious problems. Other kinds of views in ethics will have some problems, but they won't be the kinds of problems that make us just sort of throw a view away like they are with subjectivism or relativism. There'll be much subtler problems that, yes, they're problems, but they're the kind of problems you might have some reasonable response to. And so there are wrong answers in ethics, right? So when you ask a question in ethics, there's a couple, there's several perspectives that might all be reasonable. So there might not be one single right answer, but there's all kinds of hundreds of things that are completely unreasonable, irrational, and obviously wrong. So don't get the idea that there's no right answer here, or because there's no right answer, there can't be any wrong answer either. Oh yes, there can be wrong answers, and very many of them. So again, as we move on through the course, we'll start to introduce some of the criteria, right? Some of the ways that we'll be able to tell when things are sort of moral facts or when they aren't, or at least to develop some procedures that have seemed to, sort of stand the test of time in helping us to come closer to whatever those moral facts are.